Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show, broadcasting on Channel 9 and on WJOPLP Newburyport FM 96.3. We're also live streaming on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just delighted to welcome today's guests. Beverly Mills and Elaine Buck are here, and they're what I've been calling restorative historians. I learned about their fascinating research in an article in the New York Times titled Uncovering Lost Black History Stone by Stone. The title of their book, in fact, is If These Stones Could Talk. They conducted archival research on the forgotten lives and achievements of African Americans buried at New Jersey's Stoutsburg Cemetery on Sourland Mountain since pre-revolutionary times. They surfaced many astonishing discoveries and aha moments. In fact, they discovered so much lost history, they had to start their own museum, and more on that later. Although we're conducting this interview during Black History Month, I'm sure that Beverly and Elaine would be quick to clarify, as I would, that restoring this history is completing and making true and whole our shared American history. So welcome, Elaine and Beverly, and thank you so much for visiting the morning show.
Thank you for having us.
Good. My pleasure entirely. I've been looking forward to this for some time. Well, let's dig in. You both have long and deep roots where you live in the Hopewell Valley in New Jersey, and you both were longtime trustees of the Stoutsburg Cemetery, but you didn't really begin researching the lives of the people buried there until 2006. So what happened to turn you both into history detectives with a mission to research and write about the lives of the African Americans buried there?
Well, it started out with a phone call from an elderly white gentleman in a town, West Amwell, not far from Hopewell Borough, where I live. And he wanted information about a small cemetery that he knew to have some enslaved African Americans buried there. There were no headstones or anything marking them, but he knew that they were buried there because he had put a memorial up with another older gentleman had put a memorial up with his uncle years ago, and so they would take care of that. It's a sacred ground, and they would take care of it. And so he wanted to know how we could stop someone from putting a driveway right through the area that he knew to be a burial ground. So he called, and after hearing the story about what he was trying to do, and hearing the names of the people that were possibly buried there, some of the enslaved African Americans, their last name were Hoagland and Dowdy, and some familiar names of our families. I mean, Beverly's family is the Hoagland family, and my husband's family is the Hoagland family.
Wow.
We went to school with some Dowdys. And we thought, oh, we better go and research. So we did. But before we did, I called the New Jersey State Cemetery Association to find out, what do you do? And she recommended that I call the New Jersey Attorney General. And so I did. I called the Attorney General's office, and he said that, this is not uncommon for African American burial grounds or Native American burial grounds to be desecrated, but it is illegal. And so we needed to put some press attention onto it, and that's what we did. We called the local newspaper, and we went over to, as a group of us, and we went to the burial ground. And when we got there, I'm going to let Beverly tell you what happened when we got there. We just are so excited to tell the story. We say all the time that this was not a coincidence. This was a godsidence, because everything just fell right into our lap from the minute we put our foot on that soil. So Beverly.
It was an amazing day. There was a couple times that we went out there, and I can remember it being just so freezing. It was bitterly cold, and we were out there just shaking. And, and while we were there was gentleman next door, and he came out of his house, and we're thinking, oh my God, here we go. We're going to, get yelled at or something's getting ready to happen. But he came out and he said, he was looking at me and he said, we know each other. Do you remember me? And I said, no. He said, we used to work together many years ago. And I said, well, yeah, I've had a few jobs and careers. So he said, no, you used to work for the state. And I said, indeed, I did. So now I'm thinking back, and we're going back like maybe 25 years more.
Oh,
I
wow.
lost track, but anyway, he remembered me and he introduced himself. And as soon as he did, the name became familiar. Oh, yeah, I do remember you. And he said, wait right there. I have something that might interest you. He went in his house and came back with a Xerox copy, one sheet out of a will. And it was the will of L. Nathan Stevenson, who was the patriarch back in the 1800s, early 1800s of that land. And that portion of the will had stipulated that that was to remain a burial ground.
Oh my gosh.
Of all,
Wow.
yeah. So he said, here, just take this in case, you can use this in some way to stop what's going on, because he was totally in disagreement of what they were trying to do. So after that, it was Elaine and I looked at each other and we said, you know what? We've never thought about who we have buried in the Stoutsburg Cemetery.
Wow.
Maybe we need to think about that.
Yeah.
And the Stoutsburg Cemetery is only like 5 miles down the road from this particular burial ground. So we really did. We went and did a further investigation of our own burial ground, which we have our family members buried there.
Wow.
My great grandparents are buried there, my grandmother and grandfather, my mother, my son.
Wow.
So we really have strong ties to that. My husband's family is buried there, his mother. And so we really were anxious to find out what were those old stones that we saw, that we just took for granted all these years when we walked past them, and what was their importance.
Well, that's such an amazing story. And what a serendipitous phone call that was, because it launched you on this path to some astounding discoveries. And well, it turned you into historians. After all, now you've written a history book and you started a museum, and more about that later. And you learned how to plumb archival records to glean the biographical information from them. But I'm curious, I know, Elaine, that when we spoke earlier preparing for this, you talked about how, your relationship with history started earlier in your life. And you said that history when you were growing up just wasn't that interesting to you because, as you put it, and I love this, they left out half the people. And, it strikes me that a history that leaves out half the people probably doesn't merit the term history. Yeah. So I'm curious to find out, as you began this work and you've become published historians now, how has your view of history opened up or shifted as you opened the lens, so to speak, to reveal the invisible other half who were left out of the official story, but were always there, even in your own family backgrounds, living and working and having families all along. They just never made it into the written records.
Yes. Well, it makes me want to dig deeper. I realized that Black people were left out of the history books intentionally. And of course, we never really delved deep into slavery in the United States because it's ugly, difficult history. And so now that we've been researching and making all these connections, local connections, that are really a national story. These stories are all throughout the United States where people are finding out that, there was a burial ground in their community or a church that dates back to the Revolutionary, period. And it just empowers me to keep digging. It's still hard to find some of the information and make the connections that we need, but we still keep looking because now that Beverly and I have been researching for so many years, we realize it's out there somewhere. It's just hidden.
Yeah.
You know, Elaine, when working with Elaine, she's like one of the funniest people I know. But anyway, talking about early on and how she was thrown out of class in history class is always my favorite story, because, you know, when we talk about, you know, why history was, you know, not exciting or relevant, felt it was relevant. I was always a history buff, but Elaine said she felt very differently. So she said, so tell them about why you got thrown out of class.
Oh, yes, please do.
Yeah, so I mean, I've gone to the same school now. I started elementary school at Hopewell Valley Central High School, or Hopewell Valley Central School District, and so now I've gone through all the elementary school. And when we did see a Black person in the history book, they were slaves picking cotton, or Black Sambo, which I thought was disgraceful. I could not, when I laid eyes on him and the people that were in that book, I thought, oh my goodness, why do they look like this, with the big red lips and their eyes and eating watermelon? And I thought, so by the time I got to ninth grade, I was done. I opened up the history book the first day of school, and I said, oh my goodness. I said, come on, there has to be more to history than just these white men with these ugly wigs. And well, the whole class busted out laughing, and the teacher said, out, go to the office. And so I said, before I left, I said, I know that there's more Black history than just Black people picking cotton and having babies. I said, so I want you to find out for me. And he really didn't take me that serious. But and I also remember when I was sitting in the office, I was still thinking, where can we find this history? So we actually, I have two teachers, Mrs. Swissler and Mr. Maselli. They were young teachers, because a lot of our teachers were older, and they just didn't have time for us young people from the 60s, 70s. And they decided that we would form a group, and we called it the Black Culture Club. And we would study, and people would come. You didn't have to be Black, anybody would come, so we could find out what, you know, there has to be Black history. And so we had a group, and we'd stay after school, and people would research and bring what they found, and we go to the libraries and try to find information, and we'd study Black history after school in the Black Culture Club.
Now, this is a predominantly white school system, 99% white that we graduated from.
That is an amazing and truly wonderful story. And part of what's wonderful about it is that you founded the club, and that people would come and engage in that. But also you clearly had a prophetic gleam in the ninth grade about something that would catch up with you later in your life.
Yes.
So anyway, I love stories like that. It gives you the sense that, you know, there's a plan in life.
That's for sure.
It just takes time to unfold. And it's like following the breadcrumbs. So thank you. I'm so glad you shared that story. That is truly wonderful.
Yes.
Well, let's get into some of your research at the cemetery, because you said that once you began recovering these untold, formerly lost stories, that you encountered some astonishing stories and had some real aha moments. So I'd like to invite you to share what were some of the most astonishing moments, or the biggest ahas, as you began restoring this history.
Well, I think for myself, the biggest aha moment was how firmly entrenched slavery was in New Jersey. You were talking, you know, when we discovered that all 13 colonies were slave holding, you know, areas, and you think like, well, how come we never knew this? You know, I graduated a few years before Elaine, and, you know, in my graduating class, there were four African Americans out of like 300, close to 300. So when we started to, and we always say when we give presentations, it's like, you know, it's not like these two older something women woke up one morning and said, you know what, let's just devote the rest of our lives now to doing this work. We just felt the calling to do this. And the deeper that we started to get into the history and to find out how firmly entrenched New Jersey was in slavery, and then finding out it was the last northern state to abolish slavery, and then it was a gradual abolition act in 1804, and you're thinking, oh my God, this system, which started right here, was the precursor, which continued on in the South, in the Deep South. And even though, as slavery began to, as the abolitionist movement, took hold and slavery waned in the North, it was still rampant in the South. And New Jersey, the Fugitive Slave Act. Oh, no problem. You're coming up from the South. Look for your slaves. Come on up. Come to New Jersey. We welcome you with open arms. And so I guess there's just so many things that I guess would be considered aha moments. Aside from the fact that I was able to trace my ancestry back 5 generations.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that we were related to the people that we were uncovering is like, you have got to be kidding me. Here we are, we're in our 60s, and now we're just finding out that, Beverly's 4 or 5 times removed great grandfather was brought here as a young enslaved African American to our town that I have lived in all my life. Brought here to the church, the Old School Baptist Church, which is one of the oldest Baptist churches in the nation. And it's right here in our town. And here this young man is brought here from South Carolina here by the pastor of the church. So all these moments that when we find out, oh, wait a minute, what's going on? And right at the Old School Baptist Church is the signer of the Declaration of Independence, John Hart. We have a big monument for him there. Then we just keep unearthing, the 5 signers of the Declaration of Independence from New Jersey, all of them were slave owners. And I just wonder what was in their minds when they were penning the Declaration of Independence, when they were slave owners. How do you pen something that talks about freedom and people being equal and all this, and you own slaves? It's mind-boggling for me.
It's mind-boggling, or should be mind-boggling for every American, because it's one of those great conundrums of American history. The idea of the constriction on the idea of equality and freedom, the compartmentalization of it. And so, go ahead, Beverly.
No, precisely. I wholeheartedly agree. And how they really embrace the caste system, and how it was so necessary to have this belief system where there's something in Oliver Hart. Now that's another story about that goes into my ancestry. On the other side of my family, this young gentleman that he was talking about, that was brought here from South Carolina. Now, his slave master had a diary that he kept, and I read portions of it. And when he was in South Carolina, he was, a huge patriot. He's, a guy that gave, a lot of money to the cause. So that was one of the reasons why he left the South and came north, is because when the British invaded Charleston, he would have been a target. So he came north, and in his diary, he talks about how we will not be slaves to the British. And I thought, how ironic is that? This choice of words is, we will not be slaves.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, you own slaves.
Yeah, right.
So, but it's for white people. So, so it's the whole our hierarchical, kind of thinking and caste system of, white superiority.
Right. And economic dependence. on the slave
absolutely.
system,
Exactly. That's
which
what
is the heart and soul of it.
that was
you
the
know.
engine that made everything.
That was the engine. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially in New Jersey, because they were making so much money, and they were also given slaves. When we go back to the beginning with Queen Anne and how she made sure that people had their merchantable supply of Negroes
Yeah.
to clear the land and to do all the things in the iron works and all the mills and to build the barns and essentially just pave the way for
wealth.
For
wealth.
wealth.
That's right.
That's passed down generation after generation. And that's why people talk about reparations for Black people. We are still behind because of that. Well, and there's no way to get ahead. I mean, right now we're trying to make $15 an hour the minimum wage, and people are having a problem with that. And I mean, who can live off of $15 an hour?
Yeah, no one.
But we're still struggling trying to even get that,
I know. Yeah, it's a whole complicated kind of system that is, I think, has not really been adequately taught. I mean, I think that after George Floyd's murder this summer, there was more of an upsurge in white people, finally showing an interest in, what does systemic racism mean? Because you'd see the phrase and it kind of like, whoa, it just goes right by you. But now I think hopefully more people understand it's not just redlining. It started long before redlining, but redlining was a factor. I mean, the usual way that you develop wealth as a family is to buy a house. If you can't get a loan to buy a house, or if your house is systematically devalued in its assessments, you can't build that wealth, and then it makes it harder to get a college education for your kids. So it's a complicated system, and I know that's part of what your consulting firm looks at now. But I wanted to go back because you've been talking about many of these astonishing kind of discoveries, and they are eye-opening, which is so important to fill in our history and understand everything that's happened over the last 400 years. But there was one thing that really surprised me when I read it, and I know it surprised you too in your research, and that has to do with finding out that in colonial New Jersey, voting rights were actually held for a period of time by African Americans and by women. And this was stunning to me. Who would have ever thought? In the decade following the Revolutionary War. I mean, it didn't last forever, but that's kind of an interesting story. And I was hoping you could say a little bit about what you discovered about those voting rights, who had them, and how and when and why. Of course, they got rolled back, because that's an old story too.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this was another revelation for us, because we didn't know that story. And we were contacted this past summer by the Museum of the American Revolution, who said, listen, I wondered if you can help us out. We have these poll lists, and we have the names of people from this poll list. And this is one of very few that we've been able to uncover in the state. But we have a very strong feeling that there may be some African Americans on here, and can you help us maybe identify, maybe recognize names, et cetera, et cetera. So we said, okay, fine. So we looked at it, and yes, we did recognize names, and actually one name was clearly marked Negro. That was
okay, no ambiguity there.
that was Thomas Blue. That was Thomas Blue.
And Ephraim Hageman.
These men, and then there was a few others we noticed, and we said, wait a minute, this guy, now I know this name, and this is an African American name. So anyway, it was an extraordinary time in New Jersey, and I think that they blew it, because when they thought, okay, so at first they passed the statute that says they defined people able to vote as he or she or they. So that really meant, if you met the criteria, if you had enough property, you were able to vote. Black or white, male or female, you made the cut. Okay. So in 1801, when we saw these names, we're thinking, wow, look at this. Look at these guys and look at these women. So there was a lot of women on there, a fair amount. You're talking about Montgomery Township, Somerset County.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really, really remarkable. So yeah, it was rolled back in 1807 because, it was pretty much the same kind of thing that's going on today with, partisan politics, controversies over slavery. There was intimidation at the polls and all kinds of things. And pretty much kind of like the same stuff we're facing today as far as voting rights. But yeah, so they said in 1807, when they rolled it back, they said they redefined the criteria and the qualifications for being able to vote because to just to white taxpayers, because male taxpayers, because of, it just, they were not voting also in the way that they had envisioned them to, that they were going to vote. So it was all control. It was all about control.
It is such an old story in American history, but the remarkable thing is that there was this brief period in there when there was an exception to the rule of either the denial of suffrage or voter suppression. So that was astonishing to me. Now, Stoutsburg Cemetery is on Sourland Mountain, and where there was an African-American community. I was hoping that you could tell us what you learned about Sourland Mountain. I mean, it's an interesting name, and could you tell us why it was called Sourland Mountain, who settled there, how they made a living, and whether it was unique or whether there were many other such African-American communities throughout New Jersey and other states?
Sourland Mountain, it actually goes back to Dutch settlers too. Sour land, because it had a unique quality in the soil that made it difficult for certain things to grow unless it was treated. But remarkably, one thing that did really thrive in that soil were peach trees. And so at one time, Hunterdon County, which at that time was Mercer, because Hunterdon was a very, very large county, had anywhere to 4 million peach trees, and peach trees were a huge industry, and the enslaved Africans and even the free people, many of them worked in the peach orchards and were basket makers, and Elaine's husband's family were basket makers. I believe that one of my ancestors, the Hubbards on that side, also were in basket making. But Sourland Mountain, it is unique, and also it was an area where white people, Blacks, and Native Americans seemed to be living together in a little hamlet, harmoniously, and without people bothering them or looking, they were way ahead of their time in that respect, except for it really upset a reporter that was coming through from the New York Times, and he got off the train for whatever reason he was there and happened to notice that this hamlet and people of all different shades and colors walking around, and he wanted to know how that could be possible. And then he saw that white women were with Black men, and so that was just enough to make him crazy. And he got back on the train and went back to New York and wrote an article that you can still access today, and it says the barbarianism in the Sourland Mountains, miscegenation, in this little rural community. So he started, sounding off about, what was going on in the Sourlands and how horrendous it was. So, I mean, you're talking about a little community that was kind of doing its own thing and then was, put on blast, so to speak, through the New York Times.
And so now I look at my husband and I say, oh my goodness, I'm married to a barbarian. Because they're talking about about my husband's family. And I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. And so we have a picture when we do our PowerPoint presentations of the descendants of these people that they were talking about. And they are absolutely beautiful. They're the
I'm
prettiest
sure.
people on earth. And to have them call these people barbarians, it's just, it makes you just laugh, because I thought, how dare he? Those are fighting words.
Well, and it's ironic too, because here you have this community which has found a way that still eludes us, of people from many different backgrounds living harmoniously together.
Yes.
It's not accidental that they were on a place where the ground was not that fertile, but they found a way to grow peaches. Good for them.
Yeah.
And so they found a way to do something that has eluded America.
And
of course, and they had to, trash it.
And I tell you, they were able to farm, and and many of them were farmers, and they made a go out of it, and they had thriving farms, and we hear about what they grew up there. It was it's just astounding.
Yeah, and we have a story that we just uncovered about Aaron Trueheart, which would be the grandson or great grandson to Friday Trueheart, that 13-year-old young man that we mentioned. So he's in the mountain. He lives in the Sourland Mountain in a cabin that now is like an architectural. When people talk about architectural wonders in New Jersey, that is one of them. And this is where Friday lived. Well, now he goes on and has children, and so one of his children invents an incubator for chickens, and people now are going and asking him, how did you do this, and how come my chickens don't lay eggs, and this, that, and the other. So I mean, these people were brilliant. And if you ever visited the Sourland Mountain, it's filled with these monstrous rocks piled on top of each other. It's not like little pebbles. These are rocks that can hardly be moved when people want to build property there, up there. And it's just unbelievable how they made a living out of nothing. I mean, Beverly calls it hard scrabble, and that's just what it is.
It's a very intimidating region to look at when people first see it.
It's very intimidating now. At night when you drive through there, there's no street lights. It's pitch black. So you have people that have hidden up in the mountains, enslaved people hid there. And also we have, we can't prove it, but some of the mob has been up there and hidden up there. And, it's just a strange area that is still strange to this day.
Another amazing story that you unearthed. It's just astonishing and fascinating. I wanted to ask you too, because I know that some of your research surfaced African Americans who had served in the Revolutionary War. Sure. I believe William Stives was one of them. And that's an amazing story too, around the documentation you found. Could you tell us about him?
Yes.
Well, he was one of the first, he was actually the first person that we started with to research, because we kind of had a head start, because Virginia Nevius, who happens to be Elaine's aunt, John and Elaine's aunt, was related to the Stives. And she really, at that, we didn't know that she was collecting this information. And when she passed away, it was given to us and say, here, you're doing research. We found this stuff from Mom. Maybe this will be useful. And it had information about the Stives family and William Stives. We don't know where he came from originally. And, that's a big question mark. But so Virginia, who had the information, had been contacted by Stives' fourth great-grandson, who had engaged a genealogist to do some research for himself. He didn't know, and so which led him to Virginia and into Hopewell, to her house. And then he said, my name is Tim Stives, and by the way, Tim Stives is a white man.
Oh.
And he said, I'm looking for the grave of my fourth great grandfather. And I believe he's been buried in the Stoutsburg cemetery. I'm not sure. So they led him up to the Stoutsburg cemetery. Then he discovered it's an all Black cemetery.
Uh-huh.
So thus his story began. So we were given a lot of that information, which we were then, putting pieces of the puzzle together, like, okay, who are these relatives? And what we discovered is that when he married a woman that was in the next neighboring Somerset County, which would literally be across the street. And they were the first Black residents in the Sourland Mountain. And they had 10 children, and out of the 10, 9 of them married. And what was interesting is that half married white and half married Black. And so from our work, these cousins have been finding one another.
Wow. Wow, that's really great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it was William Stives. Didn't you find his discharge papers from the Revolutionary War?
Yes. Oh, Elaine was there that day. I was. That was one of our many, many trips to the David Library.
Yeah, so we would go back and forth to the David Library of the American Revolution in Pennsylvania in the Washington Crossing Park. And so we were looking, I mean, there are these huge books from General Stryker, and it lists who was in the Continental Army. And so luckily, I mean, these books are huge. So we're laying them out on the table. Now the librarian is helping us look, and some of the volunteers that were there were helping us look. And an intern was there, a young man. And he said, let me just go look on the microfilm and let's see what we can find, because you have to dig deep to find the information. And it wasn't like we were looking in one book. We were looking in many books. I can't even tell you how many books we had to look through. And luckily, when they marked down the Black soldiers that were in the Revolutionary War, they put that they were Black. Matter of fact, they called them Dick Negro or Pompey Black or whatever. So you could tell that it was a Black person. This young man went over to the microfilm and he unearthed the discharge papers signed by General George Washington for William Stives, who was a fifer. And so he printed it out. It's very faint because it's 300 years
It's
old.
old.
Yeah, but you can see William Stives. You can also see General George Washington's signature.
Wow.
And then he also unearthed that he was given the badge of merit, which is, like our today, what people are getting today when they get something from the president or whatever. It's a high honor.
Yeah.
And so William Stives received that, and we have his discharge papers, and we just have so much information on him that we never would have thought of had it not been from that one phone call that got us digging. So at the Stoutsburg Cemetery, Tim Stives put a memorial marker for William Stives. We're still investigating, trying to find out, where is William Stives buried at? He would either be buried at Stoutsburg with the rest of the Black people, because it was illegal for Black people to be buried with white people. So we're assuming, but we really have to keep, we've looked everywhere to try to figure out where else he would be buried. And the only other place he would be buried is possibly the Old School Baptist Church, because he was a member there for 40 years. And hopefully he is not buried in their yard, because they had a special section for the Black people that went to the church. And Friday Trueheart is buried in the yard there, but it's in the colored section. And so we hope that this man that received the badge of merit is not in the colored section. He's certainly not out front with John Hart and all these other people. He's not out there. I looked.
Well,
unless he's out there without a headstone, but and they don't have him in his records as being buried there. They just have him being a member for over 40 years.
what a great moment, the moment to see that discharge paper signed by George Washington, a great, and any historian, you don't come across documentation like that every day, but also just so important to make sure that those stories about African Americans participating in a foundational event in our history, a mythological event, it's just so important. So good for you for restoring part of that narrative. You've talked some about, you've mentioned the name Friday Trueheart, and Beverly, he's, what you discover, he's your, I think, fourth great grandfather.
Yes.
But I was wondering, you mentioned Oliver Hart, the minister, who was his owner, who moved to New Jersey. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more, whatever you know about Friday Trueheart, including why he was named Friday, and then how he became the inspiration for the consulting firm that the two of you founded.
Well, it's still a mystery how he received the name Friday. There was a book written. Who wrote? Elaine, refresh my memory.
Alice Lewis Blackwell.
Alice Lewis Blackwell, yes. And, we've had several historians and write about this region because it's so rich in history. We're a stone's throw away from, where Washington crossed the Delaware. So, it's throughout the years, it's been just ripe for this kind of, for books and things. And so Alice Lewis Blackwell wrote about the area, and she did talk about the Old School Baptist Church, and was shedding a little light on some of the pastors there. And she talked about Oliver Hart, and then she mentioned that he brought with him Friday, and that he was from Africa, and that he bought him from a slave captain, and that he named him Friday after Robinson Crusoe, or some kind of story. Well, when I read that initially, and then when I found the diary, and which had been transcribed, and I'm reading this diary, and it talks about when he purchased Friday and his mother, and it had nothing to do with, him coming right off of a slave ship or what have you, because he said his name was Friday, and his mother's name was Dinah, and he paid how much he paid for the two of them, and the date. And I'm thinking, well, where did this woman get this other information about, coming off? I don't know. But anyway, so how this name came to be, I don't know. The story is that he took the last name Hart, but was told that he was his character was so fine, and he was such a lovely man and true of heart, that they started calling him Trueheart. You're such a true heart. So he adopted the last name Trueheart. That's what that's from oral history from the family.
That's a good, the naming is a good part. The part about being bought as a child with his mother is just tragic. But you named, then you continued to honor him, because in 2018, the two of you founded Friday Trueheart Consultants. And you provide consulting to schools and community groups and others who, and I got this from your website, so fill it in if I got it wrong, but to seek a better understanding of the slave system. And I would like to ask you more about the work that you do with Friday Trueheart Consulting, whom you work with, and what are the gaps in knowledge of the general public or of educators that you are of most concern to you, and that you most hope to be able to fill in for people?
Well, I think that there has been a woeful lack of information about the African American experience, and because it was designed that way. And whatever information people do have, it's either, sanitized or, just, whitewashed in some fashion or whatever. And what we found is that many of the teachers are white, and for them to to delve into teaching African American history, particularly if there are African American students in the classroom, it makes them uncomfortable.
Mm.
And because it is a difficult topic, it's a very difficult topic to talk about. And particularly if you go beyond the go-to Black History Month,
Yeah.
Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, if you delve beyond that, you're going into uncharted territory. What do I talk about, and how do I explain this with still remaining sensitive to how I'm delivering this information, which is going to be ugly if you're telling the truth.
Right.
So we have kind of stepped in, not only with providing information that, okay, let's talk about the true narrative of what, of slavery. Let's talk about this. So let's talk about what happened right here. Let's start there as a starting point, so we can talk to you about my ancestry. We can talk about how this was, slavery took hold and was such a prevalent system in Hopewell Township. And it's kind of like taking a micro look and then expanding out. So I think in some respects, it's made it easier to have that conversation when, we're there to personalize and say, well, this happened here, this happened here, but now we can take a bigger look at, okay, so what's happened throughout the United States? What happened, so and so and so and so. So I think that's why we started the consulting business, because we just need to keep spreading the word.
Well, and we also would like for people to know how to research and how do you find out the information from your own community. I remember when I first met you, I asked you about your town, and you said it was and that it was a port town and that you had clippers or whatever. And I remember asking you, did these clipper ships, where did they go? And so now in my mind, I want to research more about your port area and find out, were these those ships that went down to the West Indies and brought enslaved people back to your community? And my mind now is opened up. Everywhere I go, I'm wondering, okay, what went on here? And I think we all in the whole United States need to find out what went on in my community.
Yes, I remember we talked about what they call the triangle trade in Newburyport. Newburyport had like 10 or 12 rum distilleries. It's those clipper ships. And they call it a triangle, as just roughly, because, backing up a little bit, I think it's a very wise approach to ground this history and what was happening locally, because things were happening locally all over America. And just that point alone helps to drive home the point that the slave system was everywhere in America. It was fundamental part of our economy. And in Newburyport, the ships would go to the Caribbean taking supplies, because all they did in the Caribbean was grow sugarcane. So they were dependent upon importing every other kind of supply. And then those clipper ships would also take rum to different ports. And they'd also bring slaves back. That's why they called it the triangle trade, because if you look at a map, from the Boston area down to the West Indies to Africa to Europe, you have different kinds of overlapping triangles. So I think that is, it's just a brilliant way that you've devised, starting with your own research. And it also, to sort of localize it and then expand kind of like a ripple effect outward from there. To people looking, as you put it, from the micro to the macro to the global. And that sounds very powerful. And of course, being able to talk about your own family histories is also very powerful, because that makes it, it brings it home in a personal way to students. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to ask you was about how you deal with or strike that balance, because the history that you've learned from the cemetery is personal, and a lot of it has to do with learning about the slave history isn't impersonal. These were your own family members, generations back. And so
Yes.
I would wanted to find out about how you found a balance between, whatever sorrow, pain, or anger or trauma, your family's experienced, and that you're learning about as you do this research, how you balance that with your continuing to shine the light as historians, restoring these life stories. Anyway, how do you manage that? Because it strikes me it could be very difficult.
Well, I have tears in my eyes right now just thinking about. I actually grew up in this in the on a street where all of my grandmother's relatives were here. So I knew my great grandmother, my great grandfather, and their sisters and brothers. We all lived on Columbia Avenue together. And I remember as a child asking them, were you a slave? And, because once I realized what a slave was, I wondered, were you a slave? And, I remember Aunt Mary, Aunt Jenny, and Grammy sitting at the table talking about that they didn't call us a slave, but they were sharecroppers. And they were sharecroppers in Danville, Virginia, on the Hayes farm. And they remember the farm, and they picked so much tobacco, and they raised pigs, and they raised all kinds of farm animals, chickens and everything. And I wondered, I said, well, that if they weren't slaves, they were sharecroppers. I thought maybe they were getting paid. Well, they got cheated at the end of the year when it came time to divvy up the shares. They were cheated out of their money. But they did have sense enough to raise their own chickens and raise their own cow and have, get their own milk and have the farm animals that they brought. They didn't bring the animals with them, but they brought that way of life with them to New Jersey when they came here. And one of the things that I do when I was researching, realized that Grammy, who was my grandmother's mother, her mother was here in the 1800s. Lizzie and Abram Waldron were here in the Sourland Mountains in the 1800s. And we lived in a house that was, I don't know how old the house is. All I know was Unky and Auntie that I heard them talk about, they lived in that house, and he definitely was an enslaved person.
Yeah.
And so all of these connections and me being able to, I didn't actually know Auntie and Unky because they had died by the time I was born, but I knew my great grandparents and their sisters and brothers, and I heard all their stories, and they taught me how to live. I mean, if I had to shoot a gun, believe me, I could shoot you. And I could actually shoot a rabbit or whatever to make sure that I could, they weren't using their guns to shoot people. They were using it to shoot animals so that they could eat.
Survival.
That's right. And they went fishing and, all of these things that they had to do because this is what they had to do as enslaved people to feed themselves.
Yeah.
And the reason why they eat the food that they ate, because I used to wonder, why would you eat chicken feet and pig feet? Now I know this is what they had left after they got done preparing the meals for the white families.
Yeah.
They really didn't have anything left except for the guts and the feet and it's just, it goes on and on to the point where it brings tears to my eyes when I think back of some of the meals that I ate with them and why they ate them, but they enjoyed it,
Mm-hmm. It was what they had.
It was what they had.
So, yeah.
You know what, Mary, when you asked that question, it did bring them back. During our presentations, we have been approached by white people who said, "Why aren't you angrier?" I really commend you for being able to deliver these presentations and and inform us and educate us without anger. I don't know whether I'd be able to do that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, the two of you have a real grace and generosity of heart about you. And I deeply appreciate your willingness to share your personal stories. And the fact that they're personal makes them supremely powerful, because you make things that can feel very abstract when read about in a textbook real and human. And that means that the process of empathy is galvanized. And I'm sure I'm with every fiber of my being, I'm sure that whoever hears the two of you speak is galvanized to feel the empathy, but also the understanding that this is a story that needs to be told. And speaking of that, just I want to find out from you. I know that there is a documentary in the works, I think.
Yeah.
And could you tell us just a little bit about that documentary and when folks might be able to learn more through that means?
Well, it's being it's called Friday Trueheart. It's called Trueheart Productions, and
Perfect.
actually, well, yeah, we didn't start. This was actually Ridgely Hutchinson, who is a dear friend, who approached us about that. He said, you know, we have to do something about teaching everyone about this history.
Yeah.
And so he spoke to some folks at NJN, and so he got the ball rolling, and they're in a fundraising phase right now, and they have all the infrastructure in place. It's just a matter of fundraising. So
you keep me posted, and I'll make sure that our watchers and listeners will know about it. And in the meantime, I want to remind everybody the title of your book is If These Stones Could Talk, and you can get it on Amazon for sure. And what can I say except thank you? I so appreciate your taking the time to visit the morning show and to share these. They are astonishing stories. They are aha moments. And it's a great service that you provided, both to do the research and to to recover the lost history on this sacred land of this cemetery, to save it, and also to spread the word about there were communities like this throughout America. And anybody who wants to learn more about how to restore that history can read your book.
Yes.
So it's just been a total honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
thank you.
It's just been glorious and wonderful. I thank you, and keep me posted on that documentary.
Sure.
And we'll have you back. All right. So, because I know there's more stories. You're going to keep finding out new things. So,
Oh,
please
there's
come back.
more.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for visiting the morning show. It's been an honor to host you. Thank you very much,
Thank
Beverly and Elaine.
you.
Well, thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you'll join us next Thursday at 9 on Channel 9 for the morning show. My guest will be historian Dr. Monica Black. She's the author of a new book called A Demon Haunted Land, Witches, Wonder, and Ghosts of the Past in Post-World War II Germany. She describes supernatural eruptions in post-World War II Germany, including witch trials and messianic faith healers in response to Germany's resounding silence about their complicity in genocide, war, and racial dictatorship. It's a fascinating and, to me, previously totally unknown chapter of World War II history, revealing what happens when we don't deal with corruption and moral toxins. And of course, Dr. Black's insights resonate with the demons of our current weird and very turbulent social and political landscape in the United States. If you missed any part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on Fort Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show, www.ncmhub.org. Just click on the icon. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m., the following Tuesday at 4 and Wednesday at 3, and will be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just go to ncmhub.org, click on the cloud icon, and scroll down. That's it for the day, everybody. Take care and have a great week. Bye.
Bye-bye.